Good afternoon. I am Pearl Dowe, the Asa Griggs Candler Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at Oxford College of Emory University. Today, I'm going to talk with you briefly about the women's suffrage movement and the work that continues. While we're celebrating the 19th Amendment, we have to acknowledge the rise of Senator Kamala Harris to become the Democratic Party's first woman of color vice presidential candidate. This is a momentous moment and a celebration for all. However, in order to really celebrate this moment, we have to acknowledge not only the suffrage movement, but the women that often have been ignored and their contributions have been dismissed in history. The suffrage movement grew from the abolitionist and temperance movement. Women were not allowed to participate with the men. And so these women formed independent organizations and sometimes auxiliary organizations to address these issues. When we think about the founding of the suffrage movement, we think about the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls in New York in 1848. The majority of the participants who participated were affluent white abolitionists, and there were a handful of free Black men and women. In addition to Sojourner Truth, there were Black women such as Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and Harriet Tubman, who participated in women's rights efforts throughout the 19th century. There were early divisions in this movement that continued into the modern women's rights movement. This included elite and middle class women who did not work, and so they could not deal with the issues of poverty, illiteracy, or the menial employment that Black women were relegated to. Racism persisted in this socially progressive movement. The National Women's Suffrage Association, which became the dominant suffrage movement organization, held conventions that did not include Black women. They held marches that Black women were not allowed to participate in. When we look at the history of women's suffrage, which was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, much of that document excludes the contributions that Black women provided to the movement. And as a result, today, we do not often think about the efforts that these women gave to the movement. In 1851, Sojourner Truth, with her powerful speech, Ain't I a Woman, challenged this, in which she argued that there was a unique position of Black women as a result of their race and gender. So when we think about the suffrage movement, particularly Black women and their participation, it is extremely unique. And when we look at a lot of the pictures of the movement, we see that white women that participated often were middle class. But with Black women, the issue actually expanded beyond class. And so I really enjoy these two pictures here. On the right is a very popular picture of the leading middle class Black women in the movement. But we also see a picture of women that were members of the headquarters for colored women voters. And we can look at their dress and their hats and see that many of them most likely were domestic workers or that they were also possibly were farmers. And so this movement forms around Black women who organized, particularly in 1896, with the National Association of Colored Women. This becomes an umbrella group of the Black Women's Club movement. Suffragist Mary Church Terrell was the founding president. The group's motto was "Lifting as we climb," in which they advocated for women's rights as a way to uplift and improve the status of Black people. The suffragists wanted the vote not just only for women, but they also wanted Black men to be enfranchised. The suffrage was an important goal for Black women reformers. Unlike predominantly white organizations, the NACW advocated for a wide range of reforms to improve the life of African Americans. This was a result of the Jim Crow laws in the South that had enforced segregation. There were limited work opportunities for Black women. If you were an educated Black woman, you were relegated to probably being a teacher. If you had no education, that meant that you were either a farmer in sharecropping or that you were a domestic worker. Black women faced physical and sexual violence in the workplace. It did not matter whether they were working in homes or businesses as cleaning women or if they were in the fields. There were stereotypes that existed, such as Mammy and Jezebels. These stereotypes justified the violence that Black women faced and their second class status. Also, these women also wanted opportunity for education for themselves and for their children. This was extremely important considering the fact that segregated schools were second class and that the children and even the young adults who participated had very few opportunities to have access to quality books, and they also took instruction in dilapidated buildings. So when we look at this movement, despite all of the great efforts and the rewards of suffrage being passed, because of the result of the racism and even the class issues that pervaded the movement, there was work that was left to be addressed. At the beginning of enfranchisement overall, Black women still found themselves to be disenfranchised, and they felt that they had been abandoned by the Republican Party, which was the dominant party at the time, as well as by white women. There was a continued conflict between white middle class women and lower income white women. White middle class women wanted to have mobility, they wanted to have parity with white men, while lower income white women just wanted access to the workforce. These issues were very dominant and they continued into the modern women's rights movement. And then also the stereotypes against women did not end with the passage of the 19th Amendment. There were stereotypes about women as leaders, and we see that that continues to persist today as women seek political office. So women as voters really have been extremely, extremely important to democracy. And this is one of the greatest legacies of the 19th Amendment. So when we look at women and how they vote, this is data that comes from the Center of American Women in Politics from Rutgers University. And what we see is that in recent elections, voter turnout rates for women have equal or exceeded voter turnout rates for men. And so we can see here that in looking at the lines that the blue lines are the women and the yellow line represents the men. Women constitute more than half the population and have cast almost 10 million more votes than men in recent elections. In every presidential election since 1980, the proportion of eligible female adults have exceeded the proportion of eligible men. In all presidential elections prior to 1980, the voter turnout rate for women was lower than the rate for men. But we see that the number of female voters exceeded the number of male voters in every presidential election since 1964. So this voting strength, as we now see, has transitioned to women seeking office and women being candidates. In the state of Georgia this year, we have seen an unprecedented number of women seeking office. There were 40 women who qualified for congressional primary races. And going into the general election, there are now 12 women running for the U.S. House of Representatives and 7 women running for Senate. So what are the next steps? How do we help these women not only just win, but be successful in the legislature? One of the things that we have to continue to do is that we have to continue to recruit and train women. We also have to train women to engage in campaigns as staffers. This is extremely important. It is important to have women as campaign managers, as fundraisers, as persons that contribute to marketing and ad buys. This really will strengthen the message and the campaign viability of women. It is also important to train women to transition to legislative bodies. This can be a steep learning curve, particularly for first-time candidates. One of the things that we have to help women learn when they enter these bodies is that rules matter, especially the unstated ones. Also, institutions are slow to move. We're in a period in which women are seeking dynamic change, but our institutions are not designed to move very fast. So how do we help these women navigate this? How do you address the issues that your constituents have elected you to do, but you're in a body that is resistant to change. How do we help women develop coalitions within legislative bodies? We know that women are very effective at coordinating and coalitioning with other people. But what about in a deeply partisan climate? How do we address those issues? How do we help women navigate these type of legislative bodies? Also, we need to help women seek out effective staffers. Again, this goes back to training other women who can also participate not just only in the campaign, but also in these legislative bodies as aides and legislative directors. So, in conclusion, while the 19th Amendment is a momentous occasion to celebrate today and every day, we still have a great amount of work because not only do we want women to vote, we also want them to succeed as candidates and as politicians. And so, some of the resources and references that you may find interesting is one, the Center for American Women in Politics, which is a center out of Rutgers University. They have a phenomenal database of elected women, women who are running for office, and other resources if you want to know more about women in politics. Then there are several books as well. There's Ida, A Sword Among Lions, which is by Paula Giddens. There's a new book that has gained a lot of attention, Martha Jones' Vanguard, which is about Black women breaking barriers. And then there's the groundbreaking work, by Rosalind Tarbuck Penn, African American Women and the Struggle for the Vote. And there are numerous other resources for you as you continue to learn more about the suffrage movement and where we are today. Thank you.